All right. Hello. Welcome to the Off by One security stream. Let's give it a moment here so it finishes connecting to all the different platforms out there. All right. I see it starting to connect in now. Great. So this week, happy to introduce our guest, Bramwell Brizendine. And one of the great things about this individual is that he has many things that he could talk about. So we had to figure out which one are we going to talk about on this session. And I'm sure we'll have him back for another one because he's been doing some really cool work out there. This particular session, we're going to be talking about shellcode or the SHAREM. Is that how you pronounce it? SHAREM?
SHAREM, yeah.
All right, great. Shellcode analysis
SHAREM
framework.
rhymes with harem, so harem of shellcodes.
Perfect. Yeah, so obviously, as you know, if you're familiar with the stream and myself, I do a lot of teaching classes and authorship, and a lot of questions often come up around just shellcode in general. It's funny, I show actually a little demonstration when I'm teaching around how to test shellcode on Linux, because the Linux system call table is static, as we all know, and it makes it really easy to kind of figure out, well, all we have to do is look in to see what's loaded in the racks register, and that we know what syscall is going on there, and we can take a look at the parameters being passed and such. But with Windows, obviously, it's a lot more tricky. That's why one of the reasons why shellcode is so much larger. So looking forward to getting into this one. I guess, Bramwell, can you give a little background about yourself and maybe introduce kind of how the origin of the project began? That'd be great.
Sure. I went and obtained a PhD in cyber operations and did that several years ago. Been working as an assistant professor previously at Dakota State University, which is a cybersecurity intensive place, and so taught a lot of advanced master's and PhD level courses and things like reverse engineering or software exploitation. Since then, I moved on to another university. Been very active in the DEF CON and Black Hat community, presenting a wide number of different talks. And I had the idea of creating a shellcode analysis framework. And since I'm in academia, one of the things we like to do is try to get money so we can hire student workers. And so I went and submitted and received an NSA research grant for $300,000. And so myself and a team of different students spent about 2 years working on this and creating this, and did an extensive amount of testing. And then 2022 in Prague at Virus Bulletin, we premiered it and have been making some updates since then.
Awesome. Yeah, Dakota State's amazing. It's funny, two quick notes on that. Anytime someone asks, like, hey, I want to go to a university for cybersecurity, which one should I go to? Especially like in the offensive space, I always recommend RIT and Dakota State University. So those two, I've always seen amazing people come out of it. And in fact, we ran a contest one time on the stream for a free license to IDA Pro, like a full-fledged license for IDA. And the winner was from Dakota State, and like solved the challenge way before anybody else. So probably partially due to your education there.
I'm not surprised. They send a huge number of students for the U.S. Cyber Games each year.
That's great. So someone submitted a great question. I was going to ask myself, so that's why it's great, of course. I'm just joking. And that was, there was this project, was the intention behind it for defensive purposes or offensive purposes, and can it be used for either or?
So that's a really good question. In the grant space, you are really very limited in terms of obtaining grants for offensive capabilities. It is possible, but it is very difficult. So my intent was officially to make it so it can be for defensive and analytical purposes. But I do think that it absolutely can and should be used for offensive purposes too, in terms of somebody wants to write shellcode, they can go and study examples, and you go to somewhere like ExploitDB and pull off a sample and run it through that. And if people are trying to create their own shellcode, they can use that for testing purposes to see if things are working as they would hope, or if there are opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, great. Makes total sense. That's what I figured. I mean, like we were saying, all things that were made for one side can absolutely and will be used by the other side. It's funny, I was doing some research for a class that I authored a while ago on the export address table filtering mitigation that Windows Defender Exploit Guard puts in. And basically it sets up guard pages on the exports table, like just what's involved in there. Basically any dynamic memory that goes to access the exports table, since that guard is there, it looks at the origin of who is trying to access it and it blocks it out. And I guess that led me to another question that someone had submitted, which is, have you seen people kind of use it for, have you seen anybody try to do any kind of prevention or fingerprinting of SHAREM? Like, has anybody tried to say, hey, I don't want my shellcode to be analyzed? Have they added any kind of polymorphism or something to it to avoid detection or analysis?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, actually. That EFA thing, I know is currently there in Exploit Guard, but it's been around for a while. I think it goes back to the early days of Emmet.
Yep.
And I know that there are ways around that. I couldn't give you a definitive answer at this point on the best way to approach that. But in terms of using it for offensive purposes, I was in London last year and presenting it at Black Hat Arsenal, and I had an individual come up to me and he told me that the previous year he had gone to some type of paid offensive security training that focused on shellcode, and they actually used SHAREM, and one of their goals was to try to make it so that the shellcode could not be detected and analyzed by SHAREM. And he told me some of what he could tell me, but he said that he was unable to disclose all of it because he had signed something saying that the information was confidential. So I know that people are out there using it for offensive security purposes to try to make sure that it can more easily evade detection. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's great. Let's see here. So, see, there's a couple more questions. I got a lot of questions on Discord. Some of them are related. I'm sure some of them you're going to cover, so I'm not going to ask them until we get to the end. And maybe you didn't cover it. I'll ask. As usual, I always encourage anyone watching, of course, to submit questions for Bramwell, and I'll happily kind of interject if it makes sense to. If it's something that's kind of unrelated or should wait till the end, we'll hold off to the end there. But I know you've got a lot you want to show. I believe you have some slides as well as some demos for us. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So if you want to try sharing your screen, we should have tested that beforehand, but we can do it now real quick.
What does the icon look like?
It's a little like computer with a plus sign in the middle.
Okay.
Bottom center should be.
Share screen. There we go.
Yeah, the number one thing I always want to make sure we do is zoom in so folks can see any kind of code or any reversing they're supposed to take a look at. Checking the questions here while you're doing that.
All right, I think I have it shared.
Yes, it is up. Perfect.
All right, so I just thought in terms of presentation, this is kind of more laid back, casual. There are different presentations. You can find them on YouTube that are more formal in nature, and we'll go and cover some of those slides. But for now, we'll just kind of dive directly into that and see an actual practical usage. So you go to exploit DB, and I went and I found a very recent shellcode and clicked on it, and it's a 64-bit one, and that is something that we do support. And so a lot of this is written directly in assembly. You could go and compile that with NASM or whatever. But what I took was I went and took this ASCII right here. So you could just simply copy that and then go over here. And then I edited that. So we just have that ASCII representation of it there. And then let's start this over. I saved it as a test.txt, and I did the -R64. So you have to tell it the actual architecture. It can't detect that on its own. So 32 or 64-bit. And so then to analyze it, let's make this a little bit bigger here. We can go and do the L for the emulator. And typically what I do is I will just hit Z and go and analyze it, initiate emulation. There's a lot of other different features you can do. For instance, you can have timeless debugging. So that's going to record every possible thing that it does. Let's go ahead and enable that. If you want to do it with the stack as well, that does slow it down a bit, but you get some additional information if you need to analyze different values added or taken from the stack. Complete code coverage, I'll talk about that later. Various other things, but we can go ahead and just start the emulation there. So this is not instantaneous. It may take 30 seconds or so, or it could be more, could be less. And the reason for that is every time it executes an instruction, we are hooking it, and we're doing a lot of analysis. There's another project, Speakeasy, then SC Debug. SC Debug is pretty old. I think Speakeasy is a little bit faster. That actually came out after I submitted the proposal for this. But in any case, ours does take a little bit longer just because we're doing a really extensive amount of analysis. So right now, there is a feature to break out of a loop. So if it gets stuck in an infinite loop, then it can break out. And it'll do that a certain number of times. It's kind of annoying, I guess, to see that displayed there.
Is this something you built in-house as far as emulation, or is it using Unicorn or Kimu or?
Yeah, so the underlying emulation is Unicorn Engine. For that's just executing the CPU instructions. But then on top of that, we have an extensive amount of stuff that I'll get into and talk about later on. So we can see some of our initial results. And so this is something that is fresh, brand new. It's not a contrived sample that I just created. So we see the APIs that are presented, the parameters. We also have structures. So that's also something unique that SHAREM does. And initially it took a lot of time for us to do it, but I guess some of my workers have gotten pretty fast at doing that. And it can pull out different artifacts. Once we exit out of that, we can also make use of the disassembler. So I can hit H to refresh that, and the big D will go and generate the disassembly. And it does this more or less instantaneously. And it goes and integrates all of the good data that we've found. So we see calling load library, it displays the parameter there, whereas otherwise it's just calling in a register, and we have no idea what the register would be. If you open this up in IDAPRO or Ghidra, you're going to have no idea what that is. That's one of the other common, or one of the other reasons why we were excited to do this is because in terms of disassembly, this is really the only project that supports disassembly of shellcode. One of my former collaborators, Max Kirsten, who used to work for Trellix but now works for the Dutch police, he also created a script so you can take the results of SHAREM and integrate that with Ghidra if you want to. That's available on his GitHub. So one other thing that we can also do, and I'll just start this, it takes a while, is we can also leverage AI. And so SHAREM is not really designed to utilize AI. It was something that wasn't the part of our original conception of this. It's something that I added, I think, in 2024. And so it just takes all of the results of what SHAREM has found, and then you can make use of OpenAI if you have a key, and then that can just basically just a massive prompt, and it goes and asks a series of questions. So AI is not involved in any of what you've seen so far, but it can then go and try to do a little bit more. And for some reason, this used to be a lot faster, but I think it may be an OpenAI issue, but it seems to take as much as 2 or 3 minutes to return an answer with the AI. So I guess we can let that wait, or we can actually, I have another one here that.
So this is another. Sorry, go ahead.
While we're waiting for that one, we can see a previous OpenAI that we made use of, and it's just asking a series of questions. So one thing that it can do is look at MITRE attack techniques and then try to make sense of what had happened. So if you don't really know the significance of a Windows API or the parameters, this can maybe give some insights to that. And so it'll give the specific API being used and tell how it's doing it. So deleting a test.bat, artifact summary, executive summary based off of not just MITRE, but just the totality of everything, because maybe MITRE is missing something. And then I thought also, this is more geared, the comprehensive analysis of disassembly and data, that's more geared towards people who are actually making their own shellcode. So if you're just an analyst, then you don't need to really see the disassembly. You can just go and enumerate the APIs and the parameters. You don't care about that level of detail. But this also goes and tries to analyze that so you can maybe understand some of the shellcode type things that are going on. So get PC, get program counter, those are common things in shellcode. And so that can show you the specific location where that occurs and give information on that. Setting up, initial setup and calls, API setup and calls. So if you're not really understanding what's going on in terms of the shellcode, that can give some additional details. PEB walking, where you use the process environment block, and then that leads you to a PE file, and you can traverse those different structures. Typically, they're all very common. API pointers, you can have like an API table, and then you can resolve the APIs and store them there, and then you could call them. Hashing routines. So a lot of times, instead of directly looking for a Windows API, you will hash that, or you have the hash in advance. And then when you're going through the PE file format, you can just hash the different entries until you find one that matches. And so give some insights into the hashing routine, different strings and data, gives the address, a description, a possible malicious usage. So maybe somebody doesn't really know the significance of something because they may be just starting out. That could give some insights there. Shellcode can actually be very complicated. It could actually be like a mini program in a lot of ways. So you can have different function calls. And so if you wanted to go and try to rename different function entries, then this would give you some ideas there. Information on dynamic API resolution, obfuscation, other comments of notes. If it can recognize different D words. So a D word is data as opposed to an instruction. And that's one of the reasons why if you go and run, or you go and try to open shellcode in IdaPro or Ghidra, it's going to misinterpret a lot of the data as instructions. And then it just kind of has a cascading effect where it starts saying that this is an instruction and then this is instruction, but it's actually just different checksums, and or it possibly could be. So placeholders for API pointers, and that's something where we look at memory writes and reads, and we can determine with a very high degree of certainty that that's their particular purpose. This is they go into the API table that I mentioned. And concluding remarks that are focused not necessarily on the malicious functionality, but more on the shellcode construction. So if somebody's trying to build their own shellcode, then that may give us some insights to that. And we could go back to the other one here, I guess.
Have you found the results with AI and the analysis to be pretty accurate with like not too many hallucinations due to the information given by SHAREM?
Sometimes they're accurate. Sometimes it oversteps a bit. And see, oh, there we go. So sometimes it gets caught a little bit, and if you hit enter, then it had already finished. And so this was the one we were previously looking at, the 64-bit one, and we can see some stuff going on there. I don't want to go over all the details of that. I don't want to be too tedious, but I guess what we could also do is we could go back and look at some of these things here in the shellcode. Actually, I'm not seeing what I was looking for.
Did you take a look at, like, just curious, the percentage of shellcode that people use on Windows? They typically use MSF Venom, or is there a lot of custom shellcode being written? It seems like most people are lazy and just go with the easiest way.
I don't have access to that type of information. So I'm not like a malware company, so I don't really get insights into. I try to go and find all the different shellcode that I can and to look at it and try to make sure that SHAREM is able to deal with it and to make updates as need be. But I do think that, so it does support obfuscation as well. And we could take a look at one that does do obfuscation here. And that is one of the actual really great things about SHAREM, is you can have something that is obfuscated and then go and emulate it and you will see not the obfuscated form, which if you go and open the obfuscated form in IDAPRO or Ghidra, it's going to just look like a bunch of random hexadecimal values. Which is absolutely correct. It's because it's encoded, but it's not too meaningful. And so if you wanted to really analyze something, this wasn't the right one. Oh, so I guess I made more use of the tool than I meant to. So this was encoded, but we went and analyzed the decoded body. So it will save the shellcode in multiple formats. So it saved this as the decoded form, which we just went and analyzed. But let's go back here and do this again so we can see the encoded format. While that's doing that, I can show you some of the different outputs. So I've run this multiple times. We have different text files. So this will give us some information, just kind of an overview of different things. If it finds a call pop, that's a get PC. And this is something that's done a separate analysis process, walk in the PEB. Most of your shellcode will have that. Unless it's using Windows syscalls, then it doesn't need that. And we can look at one of those later. Strings that it's pulled out, the disassembly that is generated. And then we see right here, we have a decoder stub. So this will go and perform the decoding. And the rest of this is actually encoded, but because of the magic of SHAREM, we're able to see it in the decoded form. And so that's indicated right there. So technically it's not correct because we should see the encoded form, but that's not really useful. If you didn't have this, you'd have to walk through like a debugger to see a lot of this, and it could be really tedious, obviously. Then all the other outputs that are saved there, that's also available in JSON format as well. If people desire that, you could have the straight disassembly. And we do also have an encoder tester. So if you wanted to go and compile this like in Visual Studio, then you can go and launch that. And then it sets a breakpoint. And so you can step through it and like WinDebug very easily. But let's go ahead and see right here. And see right here, it says this may be self-modifying code switching to decoded shellcode. So it automatically detects that and it automatically makes the switch. And so what we do is we use SSDeep. SSDeep is a fuzzy hash. And so it's often used in malware. And so if you have one thing and then you do another fuzzy hash, you could be like, okay, this is 40% the same, 90% the same, 0%, etc. And so if something's significantly different, then it's pretty obvious it's self-modifying. In order for this to, so if we go and look at this in our disassembly, of course we see it straight away. We have our decoder stub there. We have some get PC stuff going on. So this gives us a reference point because when you're in shellcode doesn't know where it is in memory. And so that can make it difficult if you want to go and try to reach a particular string, or if you want to go and save an API runtime address at a location and then call it later, it doesn't know how to get to that location. So this gives us a common reference point. We get that, move that into EDX, do a slight adjustment, and then EDX can be our reference point. And so if we're actually writing our shellcode, we can go and use labels. The shellcode will actually, when you go and compile it, it won't use labels. Of course, it'll just use offsets. And so that's something that will just be automatically generated. And so you can have a lot of different ways to call things. So here we're just doing call dword pointer EDX point plus whatever. We could move that location into a register and call it as, like, for instance, call EBX or whatever. So you have a lot of options. And then we go down here. These are our API pointers. So this would be the API table where these would be stored. And then whatever that was, I forget, we could get to that location. It has the runtime address, which has been resolved. And so then you can go and call that. A lot of your shellcode is just going to be typical going through the process of walking the PEB and then resolving the runtime address of the different APIs. So if we look right here, we have call, offset. We could go to DC, and then they have labels for each of them, so it makes it a little bit easier to find them. I think I said DC. There we go. So right here, this is something that SHAREM does, is it can detect that there's PEB walking features, and so and you can, we went and figured out there's like 300 or so different variations of how you could do this that we found. I've thought of some other ones since then, haven't updated it, but this allows us to label some of these common features that we need. So we get the TIB or the TEB, and then the LDR data, and the list entry. And then from there, then we can move on typically to, we get to the base of a DLL, where the MZ there, and then we can use known structures from the PE file format and walk them and traverse them until we can go and find the runtime address. We'll have some loops, and we'll go through loops that may loop through a couple thousand times, depending on how many different runtime APIs it supports, until it finds a match. Obviously, I skipped over a lot there. I was kind of glossing over it. But once it goes and gets that, so like I said, it's a function. So it can, when we had that initial function up there calling DC. When we call that, we're taking the address of the next instruction, putting that on the stack, which would be poppydx. So once that function completes, then we can return back here, and then we can go directly make use of that. So it just really comes down to the original shellcode author. There's a lot of variation that is possible. So typically you'll see a lot of that common PEB walking and PE file format, and then making use of different APIs.
I was going to say on that note, because a couple questions come up a couple times on Discord now, which is like going back and reading Matt Miller's Escapes Win32 shellcode. I'm sure you read that paper a long time ago, and it showed the PEB walking technique and an SEH technique, which I don't think works on 64-bit, but did on 32-bit. As far as like going to GS offset 60 or FS offset 30, finding the PEB, going to the third listed module, which is kernel 32. Are you seeing a lot of variations? I heard you say something, you've seen a lot of different ways of doing something, and I missed maybe what you were referring to.
So there's actually 9 different ways you don't have to necessarily go to kernel base or I'm sorry. You have 3 different modules list you could go through. So you have that. We have the PEB. You could also make some Windows syscalls. Windows syscalls could also be used to go and leak PEB addresses. We don't have support for that in this right now. But a lot of people, from what I've been saying, that they often do use the more common techniques. Yeah. Our tool actually doesn't support, if you go and do that SEH way that Matt Miller talked about, we didn't bake in any support for that necessarily, or I haven't tested it. But so that may be something that we could possibly add to this.
Yeah, great. This is fantastic. I really love it. Yeah, for those of you who have joined late, we're looking at the SHAREM Shellcode analysis framework that Bramwell was involved in developing. And it's just, especially on the defensive side, those who don't have a strong reverse engineering background or exploit development background and all that may not be as familiar with ways to figure out what the shellcode on Windows is actually doing. It's much easier on Linux to figure that out, but on Windows, it can be more difficult. And just from what he's shown so far, it's just fantastic at being able to summarize, especially, like I said, for those who maybe don't have a reversing background and integrating support with AI, to just really give you a great summary as to what this is actually doing. Does this support ARM on Windows, or is it x64?
No, it doesn't support ARM. I think that'd be a whole other, it might be a whole other, it might actually not be that much work to go and support it. We haven't done it. Once our funding ran out, then I had several students that were working on it. One summer I had like 3 or 4 working full time, and So now it's just more on a volunteer basis. So that would probably require a little bit more effort, but not a significant amount of effort. One thing that I should add, or maybe I could add, is I've actually received a new grant for $500,000 from DARPA, and we're going to take a lot of what is done in SHAREM and extend that to PE files and ELF files. And over the next 2 years, we've actually just started that like earlier this month. So some that'll have some interesting and unique features that are not present anywhere else.
That's awesome.
Do you want to take a look at a Windows syscall one, or?
Yeah, for sure.
So obviously Windows syscalls are pretty popular in offensive security. And I thought when I started this project, I thought, well, we probably have a lot of different shellcodes that make use of syscalls, but it turns out that I couldn't find any examples except for one from 2005. It was a Windows XP era, and everything's there were just kind of hard coded. Windows the OS doesn't work that way anymore. And so in order for this to work, we had to figure out the ways to go and do it. And in particular for syswow64, where you're doing 32-bit on 64-bit architecture, that was a little bit more challenging. And it actually turned out that you kind of have to have it so that it's making like 2 return calls, which is kind of not very obvious. But we can go ahead and emulate this one. And this one, you get that almost instantaneously because we're not having to go and do thousands of different loops. We're only doing 358. And this is a modern version of that 2005 shellcode. So when you're doing things with Windows syscalls or even NTDLL functions, it's a lot more work and effort. And to get them to work correctly, it can take more effort. And this one is really a way to do the equivalent of like create process. You can do create process and cause something to start executing. But doing the NT version of that is something that is, when I last looked, which was about a year ago, I think I saw one website that described they had some ideas for in terms of how that could work, but it's a lot more difficult to get that to work than it is in doing it more straightforward fashion with Windows APIs. And so what this is doing instead is creating persistence. And again, we're copying the 2005 shellcode, but redoing it because the way they did it had changed. So you create persistence with different registry keys. And so then when you restart it, then it goes and executes things. So it denotes that it's a syscall. It can detect that. We have the P object attributes, which those are very common for lots of syscalls. So it's kind of tedious. You have to go through and create them in the shellcode directly. So we have current version run. So that's very common for persistence mechanisms. And then setting a key value. And this is just proof of concept. So it's just calc there. And then just gracefully closing it and terminating it, which you don't really necessarily even need. And these are artifacts that it can detect. So it actually has kind of its own little pseudo file system, pseudo registry. And so it can detect things you add to the registry, you add it, edit it, etc. Things that you may add to the file system. And then different techniques that can detect. And it's not using AI to find any of that. It's just our own internal logic that is present there. And if you go and look at the actual code for this, we don't have any of that PEB stuff. And I'm not sure if we can, yeah, there we go. We do actually use the FS30 so that we can do detection of the OS build. And there are lots of ways to go and resolve Windows. They call them SSNs, syscall system numbers. And so that's one of the challenges with using them, because if you go from one version of Windows 10 to or one OS build to another, then the SSN could change. You go to Windows 7, it could change. So this one is just creating kind of a table of ones. So when you go on, I have another project that can create shellcode, and so this was used for that. And so You can tell it which different versions you want it to support, and so it can provide them. Whereas if you have something more like, say, SysWhispers 2 or etc., you might go through, or I actually think it's SysWhispers 1, where they had they just went through every single possible value, and if you do that, then it can be very there's a tremendous amount of code. So if you know that you're going to do something recent, do you need to go and test like a version of Windows 10 that was being used 5 years ago? They're probably not using it. So maybe you test 2 or 3 most recent ones of Windows 10, Windows 11. If you want to hit Windows 7, then you can do that. So there are ways to, if you think about it logically, you can make your code more economical so it doesn't take up as much space. But in any case, and then a lot of the rest of this here is just kind of building some of these different values or strings. And it can indicate, so you go and call dword pointer fsc0. This is actually what you're doing when you're calling a Windows syscall under syswow64. If you're doing it in 64-bit, then it's a lot more straightforward. That's a lot easier to do. So it's not actually telling it right there. So in terms of the disassembly for Windows syscalls, doesn't give as much information, but we had all that other data that was provided to us.
That's great. Duncan Ogilvy, the great Duncan Ogilvy is here. He was asking, did you look at Dumpulator and Icicle for emulation? I know we talked about Unicorn earlier.
I have not. I'd actually would be interested in looking into that for the next project that I'm doing, because I'm trying to decide when I do P file emulation if we want to move away from Unicorn Engine and go and try something else.
Nice. All right. We jump over here to some questions and see which ones are related here. So one question is, what exact API syscall coverage does SHAREM have today, and how do you measure it?
So all this API syscall coverage that we did, I did that in 2022 and did some updates in 2023. So at that point, had like 99% of them. What I did is I went and searched on Google for every Windows syscall, and so lots of projects that are doing some type of emulation or not necessarily emulation, but they're using it in some way. We could find the function prototypes, and from that I can take those and then generate support. So if there's something that is a little bit slightly newer, then that possibly may not be there. And you can go in there in the emulation. There's actually not a lot of shellcode that uses that. I was talking to, I forget his name, but it was a young guy who created the technique that was behind SysWhispers 2, and I was messaging him for a while, and I just lost my train of thought there. Sorry. What was the question again? Sorry.
That was, what exact API syscall coverage does SHAREM have today, and how do you measure it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I don't really have too much more to add other than what I said there. I think that we could improve some of the more recent things. We probably could add some additional if there are any other new Windows syscalls that have come out since then. But otherwise, it was like 99% that were available, and this is user mode only, so you can actually do kernel mode shellcode. There's some additional support we could probably provide for that, but we don't have that, unfortunately. So that could be maybe a future effort, or if somebody in the community has some ideas, then they can go and maybe get in contact with me, and we can maybe try to incorporate that. And then just in general, people have ideas for things like you talked about for offensive security purposes, trying to make it so SHAREM can't go and provide analysis. If somebody's found a way to overcome that and they want to share that, then they can get in touch and provide samples, and we can try to to make it work without having actual samples, then it's kind of hard to do it and test it.
Totally. It's a good question. Kind of more on automation, I guess. How deterministic are runs? If a sample is rerun, do you get identical traces?
I would think, I haven't actually tested that, but actually you remind me of something that I probably haven't talked about. I think this is the one. So what I'm wanted to show you guys and talk about is complete code coverage. This is one of the innovative features of SHAREM. So if you have something in a shellcode and it goes and looks for something, say you want to go and download something and it doesn't download it correctly. Oh, this isn't the right one. So if it goes and looks for something, it's not able to find it. With the complete code coverage, it's going to take a snapshot of when you get to, you have an opportunity to go left or go right. If you go left, but you never go right, it's going to save and log all that information. And so with this one, we only see so much. It's doing a search for a particular computer name. And if it doesn't find the right computer name, then it's going to terminate prematurely. So you miss out on some of the content. And so my idea was, how can we force it to go and see everything that is possible? And the idea, what we could do is do complete code coverage. So we can enable that. And then we can rerun that. And so if the shellcode does terminate prematurely, then it can force it to restart. We've saved the registry contents. We've saved stuff on the stack. And so if you were building something on the stack for like a function call or something, then we don't lose that, because if we lost that and then didn't have that saved, then we would just get nonsense results. We go back here with complete code coverage, the exact same shellcode. And now we see that they're setting a registry key for terminal server. And so this was actually created by a student of mine, because I used to teach shellcode, how to build shellcode on one of my exploitation courses, and something he submitted, and something that he actually made for his workplace, where if you were doing something, or just kind of a proof of concept that he could later adapt for his workplace, where you didn't want to go and do something offensively if it wasn't the right particular machine. And so I think that's a good illustration of complete code coverage, where we can get a much more detailed information.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, because another question that was asked was, how are network and file system interactions modeled? Can you stub network responses or feed canned OS state registry entries?
So if there are some stuff on the network, then there are some APIs that are supported where it'll actually go and download those resources online. And we could actually, I think I have an illustration here somewhere. Maybe I'm too slow to find it. I guess I'll just talk about it. If it does find something, then it can go and download it. It can hash it. It can indicate that you have a successful HTTP status code. If the network resource is not available, it's been taken down, then what SHAREM will always do is it will simulate success, because you want to try to get as much content as you can in terms of discovering what the shellcode is trying to do. And so you're always trying to simulate success. So that better supports that. Because if you didn't, if we were not using the complete code coverage and it was expecting something to be downloaded and something was not downloaded, then it would just terminate prematurely. But if something is successfully downloaded, then we can simulate success there. We do have a lot of stubs that are supported. So we support actually about 30,000 different APIs. Not all of them have handcrafted hooks, but we have about 600 or 700, or some of them that have been created. And those are all done individually by different developers that we're working on at SHAREM.
Great. Another question that came up is what kinds of runtime artifacts does SHAREM produce, like API call traces, memory dumps, deobfuscated code, execution traces, IOC?
It tries to get as much as it can. So pretty much any type of artifact that it can find. I'd say probably most of what you've said, it's looking for different types of ILCs. If it doesn't find the ILC directly in terms of being able to classify it as something, it can provide it as a string as well. But it does have quite a bit. I can go and see here. We have a slide that shows more.
And just a question to viewers. Somebody pointed out that there's some frozen or intermittent audio issues. I hadn't heard that from anyone else. If anyone else is getting that, please let me know, because I want to make sure we're troubleshooting that if that's happening. I think everything's going smoothly, but just double check.
So here are some additional artifacts, command lines that can go and classify those. We have a lot that are provided there. And here's actually some of that, what I was talking about with downloading files. So you have a file that was originally something and then it's renamed as something else. You can see the different paths because we have a pseudo file system. You can see that it's going to create a file. Downloading a live file. We have a 200 HTTP status code that lets us know that we were successful. We have the actual MD5 hash that is generated. It also tries to provide smart output whenever possible. So we have actually several hundred of these. So instead of having the hexadecimal value, we can provide these more directly. Some of these are pretty obvious, like, page execute, read, write, and it's hex 40. I think a lot of people would know that. But then there are others that are going to be less familiar. And so if it's an API that you've never heard of before, then you may not know what all the different possibilities are. And so we just have different lookup dictionaries to support some of those. We have different structures that are supported. You can even have nested structures that supported unions. So if you have something where they're occupying the same memory, it's not very common, but we want to accurately reflect that. Some more emulation artifacts. Going back to your question, I think that's kind of repetitive there. Some registry emulation artifacts. Because we have our own little pseudo registry system, it's able to record a lot of that information. Some more registry actions that are taking place. Handles to registry keys. So if you're actually making use of stuff with the registry, a lot of times what you're dealing with is a handle directly. So if you were following something like WinDebug and you have hex D3, it's something that's dynamically generated. Well, what is hex D3? You may not know that, or you'd have to go and figure that out, which you could do. It just takes time and effort. So what SHAREM does is it also will take any of our handles. It has a handleable manager system, and so it can register different things as being a handle and associate that with something. So if we have a handle to a particular key, we can display the key directly rather than the hex that corresponds to that. So instead of saying some random hex value that SHAREM created an emulation, we're saying the relevant key to that. And it does other things like that with different handles too. We have our little registry syscalls, and it's doing a similar thing to that. So it supports NT create key, so syscall, and we have our object attribute structure there. And you want me to keep going and showing more off of my slides, or you have any questions? Or I could go on forever.
One question that came up, and I figured this would come up, but what would your recommendations be for someone who wants to prevent emulator fingerprinting by adversarial shellcode?
I would say for that is work really hard on how you encode your shellcode. If you're doing something in a very cutting edge fashion, um, the person that told me before that I think when they were successful, they mentioned something about nested loops. Um, and SHAREM, I think, wasn't able to accommodate that. So if you have a lot of that, that could be a possibility. Um, if it's a pretty common type of encoding technique that you're making use of, then SHAREM probably can deal with that. If you're doing more unusual or strange things that are not common, then it's possible that you might find a way to make it so SHAREM crashes and can't deal with it.
Nice.
Another good thing you can also do, especially if you're trying to learn, is the timeless debugging feature. You can enable that, and then that goes and shows you all the different instructions that you did, and it just does it in a very simple, naive fashion. Somebody could probably improve how we did this. It's just outputs as a text file, so you can see the actual instructions, the register states before, as well as after. And so, if you're trying to troubleshoot a shellcode, then that could be something that could be helpful. Especially for somebody who's trying to, from the offensive side of something, just, that makes some kind of basic, a common mistake, and they can't figure out what's wrong, then maybe timeless debugging can help them see that they did something slightly wrong. And then if it crashes, at the very end of the shellcode you can see that it goes to, and we don't see this shown here, but say it goes to call EDX, and you can see that EDX is 0. Well, why is it 0? You can maybe try and troubleshoot that. And then we have the stack as well there, so you can see something's pushed to the stack. And
that's neat. Sorry, jumping around different Discord channels trying to grab the questions. This is an interesting one. Which Windows behaviors are not emulated or are best validated in a live sandbox, like drivers, kernel objects, GPU, hardware back features, things like that?
It's a good question. We don't have some of that kernel level content supported. We actually go do and support a lot of the Windows architecture, and there's some good slides here that talk about some of this. So things like the PEB, the TEB, the different module lists, we have a lot of that, but we don't have a lot of the kernel level or driver level things, and that's just because we don't have support for shellcode that's targeting kernel mode activities. I did mention we are doing a new project in the future that'll come out in a couple of years, and so we will have more of that type of support, and probably some of that will carry over to SHAREM. But one thing that we do, and as I mentioned, there are other projects that can emulate shellcode, and this is something that is pretty unique, is a lot of them, as far as I'm aware, they will use dummy values for different things, and we don't do that at all. So when you go and run SHAREM for the first time, it's going to go and extract the DLLs. So if you do 32-bit, it's going to go and get the 32-bit DLLs. It actually gets 60 of them. And when you go and you do stuff in shellcode, it's going to actually automatically inflate it, and it's going to change slightly from how it is statically. So if you just took the static ones, then that's not going to be useful. So they need to be inflated according to what's going to happen in the real world. So if you're actually using them in a process, then they're not going to appear to be exactly how they are statically. And so that actually took a while to figure out, but just looking at some of the different things in the PE file format, we come up with a formula to do that. So we'll go and extract them, we will inflate them, and then we will save them into a directory on Windows. And so when you go and do emulate the shellcode, it will actually get these DLLs and then put them into memory. And the reason for that is if you were to use just all pure dummy values, that would work for a lot of things. But some people, shellcode authors, may go and try to do things that are a little bit more weird or unusual, more complicated. and it may actually require that the actual DLL is in memory. And if it was not, then you're going to miss out on some of the possible functionality. So we provide all of those as well. So when it goes and tries to, when it goes and resolves something and tries to call a particular address, we have that address associated with a particular API, and then we can hook it and then do all of our analysis stuff. We're not actually executing the Windows APIs. We have different stubs or API hooks for each of them that we have, and like as I said, we have about 30,000 of them.
Wow.
But yeah, we do have that's kind of how we provide some of our underlying Windows support.
Great. I'm getting some pretty technical questions coming in on the private Discord channel. Let me see here. How are threads synchronization? This is exploit development stuff, I guess, but how are threads synchronization and APCs simulated? Can the emulator model thread scheduling relevant to race conditions?
Yeah, it was something we were actually talking about for the PE file emulator that we were wanting to do. It's not doing that for shellcode. Shellcodes often are not going to make use of, they're more simple where that's not going to often come into play. That's a great question, but it doesn't currently support threads. Absolutely super relevant for PE files.
So someone who knows your name, who's going by the name Quantumite, says hello, and he's a colleague of yours, or was.
Dr. Austin Norby.
Nice. Here's another. How does SHAREM handle timing, randomness, and non-determinism? Can those be seeded or controlled?
So lots of different APIs. If we go and have a situation where there's something that's special or unique, then we'll have a handcrafted API hook, and some of them can be very extensive, and that's why we have things like pseudo file system or pseudo registries and all of that kind of stuff. And it's very extensive. What we do have for this example, we have virtual alloc. We're going to actually go and allocate memory inside of Unicorn Engine if it wasn't already allocated. So if there's something special like that comes up, we handle it on for this particular project on a Windows API per API basis if it's needed. I can't think off the top of my head an example where we are using it. So whatever API that it comes into play where it's applicable, there may be support for that. But I don't know. The whole project is actually quite massive. It's not trivial. It's just a huge amount of code. So even I'm not familiar with every single API on it. I didn't write all of it. As I mentioned, there's about quite a lot of people. I probably should show their names. The slide that shows that.
All right, and for those listening, we'll probably be wrapping it up here in a little bit. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and post them for Bramwell.
I guess I can share while we're waiting there. One thing that this SHAREM does do is, as I mentioned, it has its own custom disassembler. And so initially when I started this research, I looked at the disassembly generated by IdaPro or Ghidra, and it was, just absolutely terrible. And so I thought, how could I come up with my own approach to disassembly that's more accurate? And so I had some shellcode samples where I had the actual source code, and I come up with different things to try to improve that. A lot of the issues were things like an instruction may misconstrue something or misinterpret data as instructions, and then that could have a cascading effect where maybe a correct instruction is started at the wrong location that produces incorrect disassembly. So I found some static ways to resolve that, but still, it was better than what IdaPro and Ghidra came up with, but still, it wasn't fully accurate. So I did have this idea of then taking the emulation data and then merging that with the disassembly, because if you go and actually emulate shellcode, you know definitively that at this particular location, like say right here, oh, that's not actually a good example, but if I'm doing XOR ECX, I know that this is the start, this is the end. And so we can mark the start and ending locations of different instructions. And so when we go and produce the disassembly, it can integrate some of that data. And if my static method of disassembly had misinterpreted it, and instead of, if the static method said 5C, then we can override it and say, okay, actually, no, it's 5B, and start at that location and at this location. And so the result is the disassembly that it produces, once it's been emulated, can be virtually flawless, especially if you're using complete code coverage where you're forcing it to traverse all of the shellcode. And then we have other things too, like if you can identify something that is a D word that's not being used, then that could be a checksum. It doesn't indicate that, but it can record that in that particular fashion, and API pointers, strings, etc. So these right here are instructions that interprets those correctly, and then everything down below is actually all data, and so the data is correctly interpreted. Whereas if you had something like IdaPro or Ghidra, it would just be complete and utter instructions. Another shout out to, if people want to use SHAREM and they don't like the disassembler format, then you can use Ghidra. This was what Max Kirsten had created. I won't go over these, but if you're interested, you can check out the DEF CON talk. He talks the last like 10 minutes or so, and he walks through this, and he has a website that provides that. So you can take this and integrate that with SHAREM with Ghidra. You can run SHAREM headless. That's one of the other features of SHAREM, is it can be run headless. So if there's somebody that, you know, they have an online platform where they have people submit malware samples or shellcode samples, you could actually run SHAREM headless. It generates the JSONs. You could take those JSONs and then go and display them and make use of them.
Nice. That's great. I feel like this question you kind of already answered. The wording's a little different. Let me see if you have anything to add on this one, though. How deterministic and faithful is SHAREM's emulation of memory layout, API semantics, and page protections for exploit relevant behaviors? And how do I control or pin those variables to reproduce an exploit reliably? It's a tough one.
There's not really a way to change any of those settings. That's probably a good idea for something that we could add in the future. So whatever is kind of hard-coded is what's currently supported.
Nice, great. Well, I don't have any other questions popping up. I know we were talking before, maybe you could come back on and give us another session on something else you've been working on. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one thing that I did do is I've, as I mentioned, I presented at a number of different DEF CON events in the past, and the most recent one dealt with an ASLR bypass. So using return-oriented programming, can you cause an ASLR bypass of certain DLLs? Can you do that in a universal fashion so it's completely reliable all the time? So that basically takes different DLLs and it makes it so you can have an ASLR bypass and make use of them. So you could do that. You could just write your own script. I wrote scripts by hand, and then later on I went and automated that and created a tool that could help with that. So we're going to talk about that more in the past. I submitted that as a bounty to Microsoft, and they didn't actually pay me. I was disappointed, but that's kind of what I expected, because why? Their reputation. But then later, when I submitted that to a DEF CON talk, and they were all very suddenly interested, and I went and met with them when I was at Black Hat last August, and there was a group of 5 of them talking to me about my exploit and wanting to have access to my slides, etc. And so that was fun. But I think that's something that if people are interested in ROP and taking your Windows-based ROP to the next level, doing some more interesting or exciting things, then that's, I think, something that a lot of people will enjoy. And there's some things there that I think that people will be surprised by.
On that note, what are your thoughts around, with shadow stacks and control flow enforcement with like the end branch instructions being mandated to be at every return address? What do you see the future of ROP? Do you think JOP and other oriented programming techniques will allow us to continue onward, or is it going to be a pretty significant blow?
So that's a great question. So in 2016, I was a graduate student, and I was doing this NSA research project in a program called Ensure. I was working with an NSA mentor, and they basically had their own control flow integrity scheme that had basically a lot of what has later been implemented by Intel. So I think Intel probably went and copied a lot of what the NSA recommended, or maybe they worked collaboratively. I don't know. But at that time, myself and some other people tried to see if we could find feasible ways to overcome them. We weren't able to do that. I think that there are some people that for the actual shadow stack and CFI implementations that are out there, I think there are some possibilities. I haven't looked too much into that recently, but I do think that possibly could be the final nail in the coffin. But the one big issue of those, like the shell stack, is hardware based. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so not a lot of people they may not have the most current CPU. So we have billions, or if not billions, hundreds of millions of computers, and people are not going to throw away their computers. We also that's also something that's compiler based. So you have an older software, and the software doesn't support that for whatever reason, and CFG is not being used. So I think that eventually it could come into play, but I think that that'll take time. And the more time we have, then there's more opportunities for for attackers to find ways to possibly overcome them. I did have one student, Logan Stratton, who went and did his PhD on, I think he called it function-oriented programming or something. And so that's where instead of just using a small chunk of executable code, you can actually just go and use the entire function itself. And so doing something like that, I think, would also be a way to do that. But obviously that's not very practical, because most of our functions are really big and complicated, and usually with ROP we're using really small chunks, and so it may not make sense. But I think that for ROP, I think we do have a period of probably at least several years left, and we'll just have to see what happens with the future. What do you think? Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tiger Lake CPU and Intel was the first processor on that side that supported it, which is a few years ago. But you're absolutely right that people aren't going to throw away their hardware. I mean, I'm still using some laptops from 7-8 years ago. Windows is always in that catch-22 position too, where they can't just flip the switch to being on and mandated for all systems, because they have to worry about breaking things and the architecture support not being there. I know, like on the processor, there's a new register called a SSP, the shadow stack pointer, that has to be there. We had a cool stream on a few months ago with someone doing jump-oriented programming, which can help obviously avoid the challenges with dealing with return pointers and end branch instructions. There's also, I think Connor McGarr, I was talking to him about it, and we also did a little session on using counterfeit object-oriented programming, which is a technique that might help you get around it. But most people, like, if it's on, just avoid it and go somewhere else, try to exploit something else on a heap or wherever. But yeah, I mean, it's funny too, because you think back, like smashing the stack for fun and profit back in the mid-90s or whatever, and even before that there were papers on stack smashing and how we're 30 plus years out, and the fact that it's still even possible is just ridiculous.
I love it that you mentioned jump-oriented programming. That was actually my first DEF CON that I did a talk on. I did a talk on a program called Jop Rocket that helps to build some JOP exploits. And so I would love to see JOP become more prevalent. There are some challenges with its usage, but there are some ways I think that could. I haven't done research on that in a couple of years, but I have some ideas for some ways to make that more efficient.
Yeah, for sure. I remember the demo. I'm trying to find it real quick so I can post up a link to it, but it takes a lot more work. It's not just like a little more work. It's usually a lot more work to get it working. But I mean, that's just the way things need to head, of course.
Yeah, that's something when I was teaching the advanced exploitation course at DSU, that's something I forced my students to do, is go and create JOP exploits. And it did take a bit of effort, but they were able to do it. So people can do it if you want to, if you just put the time and effort into it.
Yeah, for sure. I can't find it right now, but I'll go ahead and post it in the description once this goes and lives on YouTube. I think that's where we're gonna wrap it up. I think that's really cool. Like I honestly, shame on me for not taking a good look at SHAREM before, and now I'm definitely gonna be using it on the daily. So thanks for doing that work. Definitely want to get you back on to talk about what you just went through on your research. And we have next week on the stream, I will be in Bangkok, Thailand, but we're still going to do one because I have to go to Singapore to speak at the GovWare conference and such. But that stream is called 7 Vulns in 7 Days. We've got Leon coming on, where he did a week-long dive into uncovering 7 CVEs in 7 days across several prominent vendors, all exploiting a common pattern: privileged services, managing software on Windows with little regard to security. So it'll be some good stuff on remote code execution, local privilege escalation, and some research he's done there. Some more on the exploitation path if you are interested in that. Yeah, if you have any questions once you listen to this after we finish up here, just go ahead and post them up on YouTube, and I'll hit up Bramwell to let him know, hey, there's a few questions there for you, so we can take a look at those. Just as I put a note in earlier, we finally got shirts printed for the channel. I've been sitting on that for a long time, and thanks to the people over at Miscreants, they gave us some free graphic designs since we're all about giving back to the community. So we'll have those available, and for channel members, of course, we'll hook you up with some of those depending on the level there. All proceeds, of course, again, go back to the community. We'll wrap it up there, but thank you so much, Bramwell, for coming on. It's really amazing work, and I can't wait to see the next stuff you do with the PE header project you got from DARPA. That's really, really cool.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to interact with you and all your different followers. If people did enjoy SHAREM, feel free to go to the GitHub and give it a star. That's all I have.
Yeah, great. So for all a few hundred of you watching right now, have a great weekend, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.